Hello, and thank you all for starting off this wonderful conference by coming to our panel. This conference is about creation. It is right and meet to celebrate the simple goodness of God's creation and our creatureliness. Yet the rational creature does not rest in natural goodness. Our reason must discern God's plan for our participation in providence, and our will must align with God's will. This rational participation in the eternal law of providence simply is the natural law. When it comes to material goods, Catholic teaching is clear. God wills that each and every one of us have sufficient resources for our flourishing. Consider the lilies in their splendor. When people fail to flourish due to material deprivation, it is not a failure of God's goodness or knowledge, but of our failure to be good stewards. As God warned Pharaoh of the famine and delivered Joseph both from the pagans and Joseph delivered both the pagans and the Jews from starvation, so are we to participate in providence, serving, to quote the Catechism, as intelligent and free causes in order to complete the work of creation, to perfect its harmony for our own good and for that of our neighbors. Now, this doctrine has come to be known as the universal destination of goods, which Pope John Paul the Great called, quote, the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. Because God gave the earth to the whole human race for the sustenance of all its members, without excluding or favoring anyone, rightful stewardship of private property must always be directed and subordinated to the flourishing of all. As St. Thomas teaches, we must hold our goods as private, taking responsibility for them, but use them as common, prudently discerning their proper contribution to the common good. Now, of all the goods of the earth, it is money that is the most difficult to use rightly. The love of money is the root of all evil. Yet if the corruption of the best is the worst, as the saying has it, lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. And if the wrong use of money is so evil, then the proper use of money must be a profound good. For example, Aristotle denounced usury as vehemently as did any Old Testament prophet, but he also wrote that money's ability to facilitate exchange is necessary for society to exist. For Aristotle and for Aquinas after him, money rightly used is a means to further means. It is an important tool to acquire real goods and services, which themselves are but the material means to flourishing. But our market society has internalized the worldview of the merchant who uses money to acquire goods which serve as the means to more money. Money has become an end in itself, a goal for its own sake, rather than always and merely a means to our communal flourishing. Accumulated in sufficient quantities, money has become what philosopher Georg Simmel called Vermögen, potency, ability, power, freedom from natural ties to kin, country, and even biology, and control over space and time, space through exclusive property rights, and time through other people's working lives. To the poor man harried by debts, time is money. To the rich man, money is time, the hours and days of life sacrificed by others to support his luxury. As Sauron bred the black orcs by twisting and perverting his elvish captives, so money in advanced modernity has been captured and changed from its proper use in facilitating exchange for the common good. Now, this would not be the fall conference were the name of Alistair MacIntyre not invoked early and often. In a 2015 essay entitled The Irrelevance of Ethics, MacIntyre warned that the teaching of business ethics is not only irrelevant to the moral character of businessmen, moreover, it is a dangerous distraction from three vital tasks. What actual ethicists must do is first, identify the structural and institutionalized injustices present in our economic life, especially those concerning our use and abuse of money. Second, we must articulate new political economic principles of desert, responsible risk-taking, and limitations to debt, principles which both describe our current economy and also point towards social structures which would form a more just economic system. Third, and most importantly, these principles must be, quote, acted upon in resistance to the continuing imposition of unjust debt, which would require, among other things, quote, years of Jubilee. So why the Jubilee? Recall that the original meaning of the word is not a mere celebration of an anniversary, but a proclamation of justice, an edict of righteousness, whereby the Hebrew people were to cancel the debts and redistribute the land. Each family back to the ancestral plot in the land promised and given by God himself, who retains ultimate ownership over the creation which we steward. The idea actually predates the Jewish people, as ancient Near Eastern kings are recorded to have canceled debts upon ascending to the throne, thereby gaining popular favor. Leviticus 25 instructs the Jews to proclaim a literal trumpet blast of freedom every 49 years. There's some historical evidence that they did so, at least on occasion. But after the Babylonian exile, with people losing track of who had lived in which land exactly, it became impossible to follow the literal command. And so the prophet Isaiah transformed the Jubilee and Sabbath year requirements into a general requirement to help the poor, not out of charity, but from a need to redress injustice. Isaiah also promised the rise of a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a king who would proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, a new Jubilee year of freedom to prisoners, liberty to captives, and good news to the poor. As we all know, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus read this text to the synagogue in Nazareth, and dramatically proclaimed that today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Christ's salvific action is both eternal and dynamic, accomplished once and for all, yet requiring the participation of the church anew in each generation. As disciples of Christ, we are required not merely to say, "I know that my Redeemer lives," but to demonstrate this truth by acting to redeem others, including redeeming them from unjust debts which inhibit their flourishing. Our panel features those working to take up Christ's call for redemptive justice and the Church's teaching on the universal destination of the goods of creation. I am Brian Boyd. I'm a moral theologian here at Notre Dame, a postdoctoral teaching fellow. And so I'm the only academic here before you today. The rest of the panel, it consists of people working on real-life projects to build out an economy of communion and to proclaim the new Jubilee. Before turning to my fellow panelists, I offer a word of caution. Catholic social teaching is often treated as a nice bonus, a good addition to the real Catholic life of going to Mass and raising good Catholic families. But as McIntyre reminds us in the introduction to Marxism and Christianity, theology is the theory of some mode of practice. So when Catholic theology is in good order, its peculiar work is to assist in making intelligible in a variety of contexts of practice what the Church teaches authoritatively as the Word of God revealed. And as John Askinus recently argued in his compelling essay, Why Conservatism Failed, traditions fade into nostalgic irrelevance when they fail to secure the material conditions necessary to continue their way of life. In order to conserve what remains of our tradition, we must become radicals, going to the root of systemic problems and coming up with profoundly new ways of doing things. Our panelists offer seeds of hope for the life of the Church. I hope you will join us in helping them to grow. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce now Bob Kloska, who after years of service in the Catholic education is currently Chief Partnership Officer for Notre Dame Federal Credit Union, the largest Catholic-oriented credit union in the United States. Bob's paper is on credit unions as institutions and metaphors for lay Catholic life.
From here or up there? What do you guys want to do? You want to go up there? Okay. We will stay here. Normally, I'm used to standing while I talk, and I talk too long. So in order to keep this to my time frame, I will stick to the notes. A credit union, I don't want to speak down to anyone, but I didn't know this my entire life. A credit union is different than a bank in that a credit union is owned by the members and it's not for profit. So we have a board of directors that are elected from the membership, but there are no shareholders to pay. Therefore, the incentive to maximize profits is eliminated. And we talk about, in our board meetings, how do we serve our membership well, because that is our structure. The concept of credit unions was developed in the early 19th century in Italy and Germany, mostly rural, and very early on was taken up by parish priests trying to help their struggling parishioners to survive financially. Nobody knows the exact origin of credit unions. They seem to have popped up in the early 1800s all over the place, like the time was ready. Many conventional banks were either not serving these people at all, or were charging too much to do so, and the idea spread quickly throughout Europe. One of the parish priests who took action to fix this problem went on to become not only a pope, but a saint. Pope St. Pius X. He actually, as a young priest, founded credit unions. So did St. Anthony Mary Claret in Spain. And there's talk about trying to promote one of them as the patron saints of credit unions, because we don't have one. There's a patron saint of bankers, but we don't want to be called bankers. In Catholic theology, members of the church are considered the body of Christ, and therefore Catholics have a moral obligation to look out for each other. People will say, we belong to each other. St. Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth told them, we are many parts, all one body. Elsewhere in Scripture, we know that by reading the Acts of the Apostles, the early church banded together to help each other both spiritually and financially. There is a shocking story in the Acts of the Apostles where an early Christian named Ananias sold a piece of property and did not share all of the proceeds with the early Christian community. So what happened to him? God struck him dead. And then, hours later, his wife came in, and the leaders asked her, hey, did you sell this property, and what was the price? And she lied about it, and God struck her dead. Honestly, I was astonished. I had never heard that story in Bible school. And it's worth going to the Acts of the Apostles and reading the context around that. So credit unions are both attempting to promote an individual good and the common good. Credit unions in particular are able to provide an example of how to place the dignity of each individual, both the members, who are the owners, and the employees, at the center of the economic and moral universe. This prophetic witness serves to bring the light of the gospel into the marketplace, and that's the individual good. Besides the good of the individual, there is the good that is linked to living in society, the common good. It is the good of all of us, made up of individuals, families, and intermediate groups who together constitute that society. To desire the common good and strive towards it is a requirement of justice and charity, says Pope Benedict XVI in Caritatis in Veritate. From Europe, credit unions spread. They spread to France, and then initially landed in the New World in Canada. The first credit union in the United States still exists. It was formed in 1908 by a French-Canadian priest in Manchester, New Hampshire. The name of the credit union was the People's Bank St. Mary's. It's known today as St. Mary's Bank. And if you ever go to Manchester, New Hampshire, you can visit the Credit Union Museum, which is in the original building where credit unions were born. I'm identifying myself as a credit union geek right now. But, from there, it spread. Now, largely parishes took this up throughout Europe and through the United States. And you could see the holistic care for a person if you were to go on the campus of a Catholic parish that had a credit union. When I first took my job, went out and visited some, and I remember visiting Holy family parish in Parma, Ohio. On the campus there, it has 3 buildings: the school, the church, and the credit union. And I was thinking about that with no sort of historical context, and it occurred to me that we often speak of a human being as being a mind, a body, and a spirit. And they had one building to serve each one of those aspects of a human person. Parishes in the early 20th century were even more of an organizing hub for community activity. You didn't have to drive to get to many of them. You walked, and they were natural meeting places where today you kind of have to get in your car, drive to the suburban parish, park at a parking lot, and intentionally show up. Where parish life in many places back then, especially among ethnic communities of immigrants, it naturally occurred around the parish, both because of the proximity and the common ethnic bond. In the 20th century, the precursor to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops was called the National Catholic Welfare Association. They had a standing committee to promote the creation of credit unions, especially at parishes. It was a push from all the bishops to get people in credit unions because of their structure and both the effect and the nature of a credit union. In November of 1960, there were over 825 Catholic credit unions in the United States, mostly because, and they were flourishing and growing because of their humanizing influence, especially among the poor. This was so enshrined into the institutional church that in Michigan, at least, they even celebrated an annual gold mass to pray for the success of the movement and strengthen it. Sometime in the 1970s, the Catholic credit unions began to decline. I won't try to talk to the causes or whatever. That would be beyond the scope of what I'm here to do. But today there are only 90 such credit unions, and my employer, Notre Dame Federal Credit Union, has identified them and organized any that want to be organized by us into the Catholic Credit Unions of America. And if you want to read further on this, go to catholicua.blog, and there's a lot of history and there's a lot on Catholic credit unions. The unfortunate irony is that 62 years after that census was taken and there were 825 Catholic credit unions and the bishops were pushing it, today we have discovered that lots of bishops don't even know the difference between a bank and a credit union. And diocesan finance councils tend to be dominated by bankers, and they don't like credit unions competing and undercutting them because credit unions aren't trying to maximize profits. And credit unions don't pay taxes because they're not for profit. And so it's almost inverted the church's institutional attitude towards credit union, with some exceptions. After the COVID and the PPP program in 2020, Notre Dame Federal Credit Union became quite popular because whereas the big banks left the diocese out to dry, we answered the phone and did their loans to save their employees and keep it open. And now we're bringing back the credit union concept among the bishops. And back then it was funny. I had bishops calling me directly on my cell phone, begging me to take on their parishes to keep their schools open. And so that was ironic. We believe, well, let me jump forward. Every pope, I did this research years ago, in the last 120 years, there might be one gap, have all been strong supporter of credit unions and have even addressed credit unions in talks at the Vatican and different places, encouraging the movement. Pope Francis's most recent one was in 2013, which was a while ago, but he gave a charge to credit unions to be more innovative and to get up to date, and because credit unions tend to lag behind sort of modern methods and whatnot. So as I'm winding this up, I would say I tell my children, when you're making financial considerations, remember this. There are 3 considerations of where you bank, and where you bank does matter, or what you buy, or who you buy it from. The first is obtaining goods and services of value, which is the purpose of economic activity. You want to buy quality things, and you want to get food, and you want to do all that. The second is who you're going to buy from. Who do you want to enrich? Because whoever you buy from is who you enrich. And the third is, where do you want your money to end up? Do you want it cycled back into a local economy, or do you want it to go off somewhere and be aggregated by a few? So as I conclude, I ask this question: what kind of world do I want to create by my spending habits? Is the world better off when I spread my economic benefit around to my neighbors or fellow parishioners? Or is it better off when I allow the benefit to accrue to a small number of people who live far away?
Thank you. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Emma Coley and Bertrand Fitzgerald, here to present on practicing the communion economy. Emma is a live-in volunteer at the Simone Catholic Worker House in Portland, Oregon. From Ohio, she completed her undergraduate studies at Princeton University. And Bert is the founder of the Simone Catholic Worker House. He received his MTS from Notre Dame in 2008 and formerly lived at South Bend's Peter Claver Catholic Worker. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. And we're going to start from the overall theme of the conference, but to not leave things in suspense, we work with Bob in Notre Dame Federal Credit Union on a model whereby, at least as we would put it, a credit union could, so Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, talked about a social structure of whereby society could be a community of communities. And we think that a credit union could also be a community of communities, so that where the relationships and decisions around money are actually happening is at the scale of relationship. So we'll get to that. A few years ago, I got to spend 2 weeks in the woods reading a good sampling of the whole of...
Thank you.
Oh.
Just from you.
Oh, turn the other one off. Right.
Ah.
There you go.
Ready now? Okay. I got to spend a couple weeks in the woods reading a good sampling of the whole Bible. It ended up being a little intensive on an aspect of the grammar of creation that inspired and now underlies the work with Notre Dame Federal Credit Union, which we'll talk about today. When reading the Bible then, I could just go up there. How's this? Okay. When reading the Bible then, much to my surprise, my attention was most drawn to God's giving the people of Israel the covenant law on Mount Sinai. God had just freed Israel, his firstborn son, from the bondage and oppression of Egypt, to worship him and live in his presence in the land he would show them. This meant that God was going to take seriously not only the cultic structure and prohibitions that would keep them free from the domination of idols and idolatrous powers, but in parallel, there was an almost equal seriousness about laying out a relational and economic structure for society that would ensure those he had released to live in the freedom of his familial love do not easily become again economically dispossessed, oppressed, or bound. And for when they did anyway, he ordained a complex of structures that mitigated major loss and kept it within a specific trajectory towards restoration. What grabbed my attention then was a possibility for parish life that, thanks to the work of people like NDFCU's Bob Kloska, we are getting a chance to practice, and which we're going to share about here. Specifically, a practice whereby folks associated with a particular community, ideally a parish community, can, through offering guarantee, redeem or prevent usurious debt in the community. The more general thrust is that by taking seriously the economic precepts of the law, the worshiping community has a framework for living as the family of God in a way that shares the grammar of, even rhymes with the Paschal mystery we celebrate Eucharistically, and as we will see, key themes of the gospel passages we hear proclaimed. In fact, in taking seriously these economic obligations, we are not moving away from the pattern of Christ's interpretation and fulfillment of the old law. Rather, we are embracing the single element of Jesus' teaching that most differentiated him from other Jewish religious authorities, and which, according to the Gospels, precipitated first a failed attempt and then a successful plot to kill him. As an initial generalization, we can say that the way he reconnected rest and restoration, the obligations and frameworks of Sabbath and those of Sabbath Jubilee, and their extension into ordinary time through the obligations of redemption, made for a rupture with the carefully and conveniently restricted notion of Sabbath represented most characteristically by Pharisees and synagogue officials who Jesus was at odds with. Luckily, we current-day synagogue officials and Pharisees have only to gain by following Christ on this one. Behind the altar at our parish in Portland, Oregon, Holy Redeemer, it says in huge letters, "In the Lord there is mercy and the fullness of redemption." What is the fullness of redemption? How does Christ's fulfillment, his filling to overflowing of the mandate to redeem kin that we celebrate in the Paschal mystery, overflow into the horizontal space of parish life, so that we might experience parish renewal around a fuller, even mundane and economic participation in the fullness of redemption? We're going to go back and forth.
When we look to the Old Testament, we find that Sabbath rest was always bound up with restoration. Restoration of right relationship, drawing us back to Genesis creation, when God beheld everything and saw that it was good. As Rabbi Neusner describes, the Sabbath call to cease from work and to rest reforms or restores one day a week the circle of family and household, with everyone at home and in place. It restores the family or the household to its original wholeness. The Sabbath day establishes the pattern for the sabbatical year, which enjoins people to leave the earth fallow, opening for gleaning by the poor. In the Jubilee year, as we heard earlier, the Sabbath of Sabbaths, occurring every 7 times 7 years, the Sabbath draws ever more of life into itself, ensuring that those for whom a day of Sabbath rest would bring rest but not restoration are released from bondage through the cancellation of debts, release of debt prisoners, and the return to family property. The seemingly most radical of these Jubilee proposals were, furthermore, mere extensions of the everyday practice of redemption, whereby in non-Jubilee years, family members are obligated to redeem or buy one another out of slavery resulting from debt bondage, and to buy back family property for a family member who is in danger of being dispossessed. The Jubilee year, then, ensures that this restoration occurs, even if humans should fall short of their obligations to one another. Through these interlocking cycles, we can see how the whole human economy is inscribed within God's plan for creation, and a liturgical order regulated by Sabbath practices. And as Bert alluded to earlier, this connection between Sabbath rest and restoration, both personal and communal, seems to have been lost in the worshiping communities of Jesus' day. Restoring these connections is a key message of Jesus' preaching and ministry. Let's begin where Brian did, with the start of Jesus' ministry in Luke 4. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus begins his ministry on the Sabbath in his home synagogue at Nazareth. He stands up and reads the beginning of Isaiah 61, declaring his mission to preach good news to the poor. And this good news is that he, the Spirit of the Lord, has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year acceptable to the Lord. The phrase, the year acceptable to the Lord, refers specifically to the Jubilee year, the time of widespread debt forgiveness and release from servitude. And Jesus, using the words of Isaiah, adds to this picture acts of physical healing. What is the relationship between all of these actions, forgiving debt, releasing prisoners, healing the blind, setting at liberty all who are oppressed? Each of these actions is an act of release from literal bondage, from physical ailment, that promotes restoration of bodily health and integrity of the family or community of those who have been held captive. Jesus then, surely to the shock of all in attendance, proclaims, "Today these words have been fulfilled in your hearing." Throughout the Gospels, it is this action and others like it on the Sabbath that lead others to conspire against Jesus. In this story, for example, after an initial enthusiastic reaction, Jesus' proclamation of a jubilee, especially his suggestion that it is a jubilee for all, not merely Israel, leads the synagogue audience to seek to throw him headlong off a cliff. In Mark 3 and Matthew 12, it is Jesus restoring health on the Sabbath that leads the Pharisees to conspire against him with the Herodians, how to destroy him. Nonetheless, Jesus' actions do not signify a nullification of Sabbath law in the ways the Pharisees were insinuating, but rather are an insistence that it provides an overarching grammar for understanding God's action and for acting in concert with it, rather than an exception to be sealed off with the right proprieties. For example, in Luke 13, Jesus is questioned for healing a crippled woman on the Sabbath, as opposed to on, in the words of the synagogue ruler, the 6 days on which work ought to be done. Jesus responds, "Ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, who Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?" In other words, of course it should happen on the Sabbath. And let us note the echoes of Luke 4's Jubilee proclamation. Healing here is presented as the loosing of bonds, the restoration of health and bodily integrity. The emphasis on the economic or physical elements of the Sabbath restoration that we're drawing out here in no way undermine the themes of Jesus' ministry or of Sabbath that are perhaps more familiar to us or to the everyday parishioner. Jesus' healing ministry can also point us back to the relationship between restoration and worship at the heart of Sabbath. Consider, for example, the language of forgiveness. The forgiveness of sins, or the interpersonal forgiveness of wrongdoings, is central to the restorative vision of Sabbath. And Jesus seems to be calling for a jubilee there too, when in Matthew 18, he instructs Peter to forgive his brother's sin against him, not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. If we look to the familiar story of the healing of the 10 lepers in the Synoptic Gospels, after Jesus heals the 10, he tells them to go, show yourselves to the priests. In other words, go show the priest that you are healed and therefore no longer excluded from the synagogue by Jewish purity laws. In these examples, Jesus reminds us that he has not just the restoration of individual health or well-being in mind, but the restoration of right interpersonal relationship, of the worshiping community, and the ability of the individual to worship. We are to offer release and to be released in every manner, so that we may worship and live with God in the freedom of familial love.
So our project. If the intensification of the grammar of the Sabbath in the Jubilee and its extension through the obligation to redeem is one of the grammatical keys of creation, how are we to participate in it? The work we share with NDFCU is our particular response, one which we would like to invite parishes into to explore living, those words again, the fullness of redemption. Working with Notre Dame Federal Credit Union, we established a program that would make the practice of redemption a practical proposition for parish communities. Bob has given us the credit union backstory already, but suffice it to say, credit unions that were historically parish-based, believe it or not, and which operated as more or less mutual aid associations, now look and feel more like larger banks, largely anonymous, lacking an underlying structure of relationship between their members, or allowing it to become merely nominal. Working with NDFCU, we designed a program that would allow parish communities to act as a subsidiary credit union community within the larger credit union. In other words, at relationship scale. This program, the guiding practice for what we call the Living Communion Initiative, allows parish communities to make zero-interest loans available to their members regardless of credit score. This is possible through two key mechanisms: individual community members offering to guarantee, or in biblical language, to be surety for one another's loans, and a community redemption fund that compensates NDFCU for the overhead costs of making the loan. We call this fund the Redemption Fund because its mechanisms are inspired by the practice of redemption. The program allows members to buy one another out of interest-bearing debt, preventing the harmful and compounding effects that an economy driven by interest has on individuals as well as our society as a whole. We'll share a story here to give you a sense of how this works in practice in our Catholic worker community, which is the pilot community for this project. And when I say that, I mean our extended community of relationships. One of our early loan recipients, an older man on a fixed income, was in a car accident last year that left him with high medical bills that he felt pressured to pay. Unable to access a reputable bank due to his lack of credit, he accepted a high-interest credit card offer that he received in the mail. He quickly became buried in debt and at an incredible 38% interest. He heard about our community while volunteering time at his parish food bank and became a member of Notre Dame Federal Credit Union with our help. After we learned about his debt, we encouraged him to submit a loan application to our community, and we set up an interview to talk about his monthly expenses and any potential barriers he saw to meeting a small monthly payment. A community committee met to review this conversation, approved the loan, and helped him to identify a guarantor from within the community. The guarantor, a member of our Catholic worker community with stable work, agreed to participate, and NDFCU refinanced the borrower's 38% interest card debt at 0% interest, taking a small fee from the community's redemption fund to cover their overhead costs. And we're not going to go into all the mechanisms here, but as an aside, that is built on a fundraising mechanism that NDFCU has for nonprofits, the money that goes in that fund. We hosted a meal with both the borrower and the guarantor to work through the details of repayment and to help establish a deeper relationship. Since getting connected with our community through this program, he now comes by our Catholic worker house multiple times a week with food for our community to stock our community-free fridge. Through these mechanisms, our banking relationships, often the most anonymous and anonymizing in the modern world, become rooted in a deeply relational context that helps us to imagine meeting all kinds of different needs in a different way. In a parish, we imagine this lending program existing alongside a commitment to creating a regular gathering space, for us a post-Mass brunch, where parishioners can deepen relationships and that can be a forum for more informally sharing needs and offerings that emerge in all areas of life. We also organize a monthly virtual gathering of participating communities and interested individuals where we explore together how this pattern of small-scale community self-organization around shared need can apply to other parts of life, from how we source our food, to how a community might navigate childcare, how it might put together an insurance pool, or basically, if we look at this relationship with NDFCU, this loan structure as a sort of beachhead practice, I like that term, what other parts of our economic relationships could be put within that same type of pattern. And that for us is the pattern of creation and redemption and restoration that we're talking about here. Thank you.
Thank you both. Next, we have Annabelle Martinez, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Jubilee Initiative for Financial Inclusion here at Notre Dame. She's a senior studying Spanish and economics. Annabelle will present on Fair Credit, a Jubilee initiative.
Hi, everyone. I'm first going to walk everyone through a bit of a thought experiment. So please imagine that you are a minimum wage employee. You work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and suddenly you're in between paychecks. Maybe it's in the middle of your bi-weekly pay schedule when your car breaks down. And this is a very big problem because you use your car to get to work, and it's going to cost around $300 for you to repair your car. So a lot of us would maybe consider this issue and think that we have a few different options. Some of them being going to a friend or family member to ask for a personal loan, or just going to a bank or some typical financial institution and meeting with a loan officer, applying for a loan, and receiving the $300. But for a lot of people in the South Bend area, neither of those options are really viable. They might have friends and family who are also struggling to make ends meet, who are also living to paycheck, or they might not have access to typical financial institutions because of a lack of credit scores, or maybe their credit score is just too bad to apply for a loan, or they don't even know how to get into a financial institution like that and start the loan process. So an option that a lot of people in South Bend and all across the U.S. tend to go to is what's called a payday lender. So payday loans are typically advertised as loans that you can use for short or temporary cash infusions, trying to get from paycheck to paycheck when you've incurred some kind of unexpected expense. But what a lot of these lenders don't make obvious to people borrowing from them is that they have an average APR, at least for the ones in the United States, of around 400%. And the way that people get trapped into a cycle of bad debt and bad loans is that when you go to a payday lender and you take out a loan for, say, $300, the lender will say, okay, you need to pay this back to me your next payday plus an interest of around $45. So you use the $300 and you get your car fixed, and you've been going to work and everything's fine. You didn't have to quit your job and you've been making money. But when you go to pay off the lender in your car and you're starting to think about what you're going to do when you have to pay $345 out of your paycheck, since you have to pay rent and you have to eat and you have to live. And if you were to approach a lender in a payday office, they would probably tell you, oh, that's totally fine. You can make your interest now, actually. If you pay your interest now, you can kind of stave off the rest of these payments for another 2 weeks. And what people typically end up doing is paying that interest payment of $45 over and over and over again for an average cycle of 4 months, actually. So at that point, when you've made that $45 payment for 4 months, every 2 weeks, that's when the APR becomes around 400%. So that's where Jiffy comes in, which stands for Jubilee Initiative for Financial Inclusion. We are a Notre Dame student-run nonprofit that attempts to provide an alternative to predatory payday lending. And part of what we do is providing low-interest loans of up to $500. Our interest is 21%, which I know sounds high, but compared to an APR of 400%, really isn't that bad. And we also have a program with our borrowers. For every single payment that they make on time, we actually rebate them the interest cost. So there's a chance to have a 0% loan. But recently, Jiffy has been trying to kind of look beyond the loan and consider more about how we can create deep and important relationships with our clients, and to kind of return the dignity back to people who are trying to participate in our increasingly financialized economy. Part of the things that we do is one of them is a joint venture actually with NDFCU for a savings program, which tries to help our clients create a bit of a savings nest, sort of, in case of an issue like this might arise. Jiffy will source clients, and with NDFCU, they can create a savings account, and Jiffy will actually match a certain portion of those savings that a client will put into their account to kind of incentivize clients to start saving, learn how to save, and budget it into their expenses. Another thing that we've started doing is the review and recommend process. During COVID, it became clear that there were things that we could not help our clients with, and occasionally we do have to say no to people and we cannot give them loans. But we have a community outreach portion of our nonprofit that basically creates relationships with other community organizations. And what we do is we'll sit down with the client who maybe was denied from the loan process or is looking for something like diapers or childcare, things that we can't provide for them. And they will sit down with CORE, tell them everything they need, and then CORE will actually report back to them with lists of organizations they can go to, including the names of the people they can speak to, phone numbers, emails, and typically will act as a door opener for clients who might not have otherwise had access to these kinds of resources or had even known about them or had even known how to find phone numbers and emails of people, because we can act as a middleman to kind of show that we have a relationship with this client, they're credible, and they need help. All of this is to say that as Notre Dame students, we've realized that there's a great need for us to give back to the community, and given that a lot of us are Catholic, returning dignity back to people is very important to a lot of us. Everyone has an inherent human dignity, and I think that it's difficult to see that sometimes, or it can be difficult for people with lots of institutional power to see that and actually act on it. So that's what Jiffy serves to do. We've been trying to return dignity back to the loan process, financial institutions, and offering our clients a way out of cyclical types of poverty that a lot of people in South Bend are currently facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle. Finally, we have Filipe Lemos and Christian Morrison presenting on the Jubilee Distributed Autonomous Organization and Cryptocurrency. Filipe is a founding member of JubileeDAO, a development operations engineer at Brazil Paralelo, and a research professor by courtesy at the Forensic and National Security Sciences Institute in Syracuse University. Christian is a founding member of JubileeDAO, a business analyst for Notre Dame's UEE division, and a contract web developer for nonprofit organizations. Okay, thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm going to do something different here. I'm going to start with the presentation because I'm a computer scientist. And we like our presentations. We like to talk more about technical stuff. So it's going to be a little different. But please, don't slip through it. I promise it's going to be interesting. So I'm here to talk about Jubilee, currency for the common good. But first I want to talk about our amazing team. A few of them are here. I want to start with Brian Boyd, which is the head of the mission. Right? Christian Moore, which is the head of technology, Father Kennedy Amadi, which is the head of outreach, and Rina Steele, the developer, and Marie Brennan, which is our marketing. And me, of course, I'm an advisor. I work as a computer engineer. I have all other, beyond my other jobs, I like tech. So I started working as a startup tech coach, which basically what it means is that I help startups that don't have the knowledge on technology, right, to understand what are the needs that they have, what are the challenges they're going to face, and how to start a startup with a scalable infrastructure. So Brian invited me to be advisor on Jubilee, and I'm going to talk a little about Jubilee now and how amazing this project is. So the first problem that Jubilee was trying to tackle was the financial structural injustice, right? When the developed world sneezes, the developing world catches a cold, right? The idea that somewhere when you have the possibility, when you have the money, it's easier for you to solve problems. But for example, in the country that I come from, I'm from Brazil, the small crisis in the United States for us is like a big crisis, right? We can feel it, people can starve, and so on. And that's basically we can talk about two structural injustices in the system, which is the originating injustice, and the ongoing injustice, right? And we can see that by the global wealth distribution, that we have a large base of people that doesn't have access to money. We have been here about how hard it is for someone with making minimum wage. We can even imagine like in third world countries where people are living with less than $1. And for example, in Brazil, where we come from, the basic it's normal for someone to make only $2 a day for supporting the whole family. So that's a major problem that we have. So the idea is how can we fix that issue, right? How can we, as Catholics, find a solution for it? So the idea was to come a Jubilee, right? A cryptocurrency for the common good. Jubilee currency, it tries to solve the originating problem by progressive redistribution of tokens on independent blockchain with proof of stake rewards to a common good treasure. I know that that's complicated, but we're going to get a little deeper on it. I promise you're going to understand this. It's not technical mumbo jumbo. Then we have the ongoing progressive redistribution of the teeth from every transaction to a specified community chest. So the idea is that we're going to getting part of the money that from every transaction and put into a community chest that can help that community. Jubilee is DAO, which controls of funds through subsidiaries. So there is no central control of it. So because everything is distributed, it's easier to understand the problem from each community. Each community can take its own decisions because they know what is better for them, right? So we don't control, there's no central power. In a country, again, let me talk about Brazil, I love Brazil. In a country like Brazil, we have, at the same time that part of Brazil it's on with snow, the other part is during summer. So thinking about that, we have a central government that's trying to distribute the same things for people, we can have injustice, right? You can be in Brazilian desert and receive a coat jacket. It's just an example of the problem with centralizing the distribution of goods, right? Because we cannot attend what every community needs. So by decentralizing it, we let each community choose what they need. And of course, with 1.3 billion of Catholics globally, nearly 1 billion in developed countries, Jubilee offers a systematic alternative for those who wish to put principles of Catholic social teaching in practice. And this is really important. So now it's the part that I like, and let me be happy to present to you. Because when we think about the competition that Jubilee is facing, right? For me, that's amazing. Because as a computer scientist, as a computer engineer, it's always good to have a proof of concept. So we have Dogecoin, we have Bitcoin, we have many cryptocurrencies that we see many injustices happen. We have, for example, when we watch Dogecoin, how Elon Musk, for example, used it to gain profit by only using one tweet. He made millions of dollars with only one tweet when he was promoting. And many people who look at that lost money and probably lost their savings buying a cryptocurrency that was not being used for something good, right? And we see the issue with many cryptocurrencies. They are not used in the proper way. And we have heard here for many of the speakers, for example, when we talk about banks, right? We can see the problems that the banks inherit when they're trying to be profitable. And sometimes they can hurt the people investing in them. So the same thing happens with cryptocurrency, right? But there is a way that we can look at it and we can see how we are able to apply the concepts of a cryptocurrency from our competitors to help people, to create a better system, a system that can actually do good instead of evil. So the main basis of it, it's amazing. We have a proof of concept technology. We know how to build it. We know how to make it scalable. So we can actually mold it to make it better, to make it in a way that we can stop the evil that has been that other cryptocurrencies are doing, and apply it in a way that we can help our communities. So the business model is a SaaS. So normally we think SaaS as software as service, but here we talk about solidarity as a service. JubileeDAO will be registered as Wyoming DAO LLC. Startups cost from two sources, right? Grants and charitable donations. early stakeholders in the staking mechanism will get the inverse tide, right? Though 90% of this staking rewards go to the common good, and 10% is returned to the stakeholders. So we keep the practice of cryptocurrencies, right, where it's an investment, but part of it goes to the common good. When the currency is stable, this will yield reliability, right? Reliability. Modest returns comparable to a charitable entity. So another important point is that access to community. Timely user-owned and operated through DEO. So the idea is that they will have control of what they do. And this is the major point, right? Each community know what they need to do, how they need to help, and the people investing on it don't need to care if the money is being well spent or how it should be spent, because the community takes their own decisions. The marketing expansion, Jubilee will always be free to use, as it takes the status of transnational currency. We have thought about doing in Nigeria, Brazil, and other countries that we know that there are issues. So the idea is to help every community worldwide. The tide of transactions is an economic costly signal, excluding many, but confirming buy-in from those who desire a systematic approach to living out Catholic social teaching on finance, right? Or market research is qualitative, focusing on building relationships between parishes who would be early adopters. Grassroots network strategy, early new parishes as Jubilee funding awareness expand, and slow and sad grow, but by trust, not booster Ponzi hype. So the main problem with that, creating the hype that we see, like we talk about Dogecoin, Bitcoin, is that it creates it can create a crisis when people decide to remove all the money from it. So it's not good, right? So by growing steadily, we can guarantee that we're not going to have this hype that Bitcoin and Dogecoin had. So Notre Dame Force for Good and Social Impact, the idea came from the theologian Weil, asking what would it take if money were redesigned from the ground up to live to the principles of Catholic social teaching. How can we promote true credit, not in righteous mammon? Enormous transformative power, right? Justice built by design to social and financial systems, building solidarity amongst fellow Catholics. There is 1 billion potential users on it, with the greatest good going to those in the most need, and impact metrics in human and social capital formation in our developing world parishes, like Brazil, Nigeria, and many others. And the main principle here is that it has already a proof of concept, and we have the chance to do good from something that is being used now to cause harm to others, right? So it's an amazing job by all these guys who have joined together to do good, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Filipe. We have about 15 minutes for questions, if anyone would like to.
So the question to Filipe. How do you make sure that the communities are using well the resources that they receive? If the stakeholders don't need to follow up with what they're doing, how you make sure they're being well used and not wasted or...
Christian, you want to?
I think they're better to answer.
Okay, that's on.
Yeah, it's on.
Okay, good. To answer that question, the good thing about this is that it's akin to a digital currency in that what we could do in terms of like a service we can offer with this is metrics. We can see directly, okay, where are these funds going to? and then we can assess the impact of those. Kind of imagine like a metric dashboard saying, okay, how effective was this? How can we would just look at KPIs and other things of the such, and say, okay, this is where we can kind of automate the process, because we can't expect parishes to be their own data scientists and kind of get insights from this. So this is something where a technological system like we're proposing will come in handy. So we can just help them optimize and say, look, we noticed that, to kind of go off with the code example, we noticed that you guys purchase coats like this. And based on the metrics we're seeing, it looks like it was good. And then we can kind of help them time it better and work on that as well.
This is for the DAO guys again. Obviously, I think one of the primary use cases for cryptocurrency thus far has been money laundering, and I'm just curious. I guess to sort of piggybacks off the last question as well a little bit. How do you guys plan on dealing with the regulatory hurdles with, obviously Nigeria, Latin America, these countries with high sanction risk and other things? What do you have any kind of centralized structure? And you're going to be registered in the United States, so this is something you're going to need to deal with. Like, what's the plan for sort of handling that?
Thank you so much. Oh, okay, great question. Thank you so much. So one of the main aspects is like when we talk about slow growth, it is because of that. We want to guarantee that it's being used not for money laundering or any bad things, right? So when we think is that take into consideration that it's not going to be used by those. For example, if we talk about Brazil is not going to use to invest money on it, but it's going to be the end part of it and receive the money to help it grow. So when we take, of course, a Brazilian can invest on it, but the investors, because we're growing slowly, and how they can use the money, we can analyze that and analyze the how they are using the money, and even help to identify any people trying to launder money. So the problem with when we get for example, Bitcoin, it's used, for example, for hacking attacks. They use that because you cannot trace it. So this is a question that we have discussed about how can we prevent that. And one way is to understand who is using and to where it's going, right? So that's a way that we think that we can prevent those types of money laundering and so on, because it's not going to be available everywhere, right? We don't believe, and we don't want that to happen. We can control where they're using. So that's for someone trying to use the money for evil, it's something that can stop them from using, because they're not going to be able, for example, to buy a house or buy something online, at least not at the beginning, right? So because it's restricted, we think that people will not try to use it, and because the information that we're gonna use it also is gonna stop them from doing.
I may have something to add on that point too. Oh, okay, good. Just making sure I don't want to step on anyone's toes. I would also say to that too, even if you look at the local level, we believe that the reason that we're having a DAO component too is it kind of fixes the deficiencies that you're noting in other cryptocurrencies. Basically, at the local level, say someone in a parish try to essentially take some money from themselves, and that's not supposed to happen. Under a DAO system, that cannot happen, and it's algorithmically enforced. The whole community would have to greenlight it. So, and I imagine that the church community will be very against that instantaneously, so that would just fail. So that kind of insulates even the end distribution point. It just insulates it from those kind of concerns. You can't launder it because, and first off too, since another advantage of this cryptocurrency system we're utilizing is it's basically a database. If you launder money, it is directly recorded on that system and publicly available to access to everyone. So it's just, you could try to, but it's just in the distribution and the public availability of that information just makes it just a really bad idea, frankly. You get caught almost instantly if you even get to launder the money in the first place.
Anyone else?
Two questions. One is, when Annabelle spoke about usury, you used the definition that I always think about. other people use the term, and that's not, I mean, I thought you were almost meaning like at any interest rate. So I'd like to just get a point of view about how the panel thinks about that. Because I think of the zero interest rate as sort of an Islamic law kind of way of thinking about banking. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm always encouraged when people are thinking about ways to attack a problem differently. Having said that, I always say to people, and I'll say this to all of you, how often do you go to your priest and say you should preach more on tithing? Because that, you know, if you look at the math across Catholic and Protestant organizations, the tithing number is really tiny. And it's a pretty direct, if you think about the math of what a church could do and a parish could do for their local community, if they had that as the mechanism, how much would a parachurch solution be necessary? But first, I have a user question, because I get confused when people use the term differently.
So one way we think about at least how we think about the problem that we think is presented by usury, is the expectation that money just kind of breeds more money, right? That's how we think. Like, what other part of life do we treat that way? Like, we were giving a presentation with some grade schoolers and used the example of, you know, if you let your friend borrow your vacuum cleaner, you don't ask for the vacuum cleaner in a half back or the vacuum cleaner in a fourth back. Like, when we think about, especially if we're focusing on money as mutual aid or the exchange of money as mutual aid, as we are in our project, that's the question that we're asking. So there are some parts of life that when you're borrowing money, you are expecting to make more money from that money. So that would be, you know, a classic example is a business loan. But for example, the type of loans that you were mentioning, you're not making more money from fixing your car to continue to go to your job, right? That's like maintaining the amount of income that you were previously having. So to expect that person to make more money from the fact that they fixed their car, like that doesn't make sense, and it creates those types of social pressure that we're talking about. And that's where you think about the problem of interest in general, which is this idea of just, you know, that money leads to, or rather that the end result of any sort of exchange is just infinite growth, which that's something that we find to be both not true and also a bad aim. And so if you think about the Gospels, where you see this image all of the time around multiplication, right, that there's certain types of multiplication that is good. Sometimes leaven is a good thing, sometimes leaven is a bad thing. This idea that something, you know, kind of replicates itself. So the question is, part of the question is, what is it that is multiplying? And so in the Gospels, it's, you know, the message of the Gospel, it's grace. These are the things that that should properly multiply themselves.
One thing I would add to that, just
Lean back and it will.
oh, sorry. Yeah, that's the problem. I think to add to that is that, yeah, a practical problem here, you could say relative to another lending relationship, this privileges the borrower at the expense of other stakeholders. So what this really puts an onus on that we haven't talked about is that this has to be in a real community. There are other ways that people can support each other. So that could be taken into account of ad hoc or structurally. And I think that's God, there's none of the mechanisms that any of us are talking about, I think, stand alone. They work insofar as they could help to gather a community in which more of the picture could be held.
We can pass that. Yeah, thanks. I would just add briefly to each of those questions. Emma gave a perfect explanation of the traditional vision of usury, which holds in a world where there's very limited economic growth. And so this is why it's not just for Muslims, but observant Jews, as well as for most of Christian history, any interest was considered unjust because economic growth was so slow. And since about the 1500s, the Thomistic school of thought has developed the idea of a natural rate of interest, where returns on money as the tool of the banker, just as a carpenter has tools that he needs. Like if a carpenter lends out his saw to someone, then there's an opportunity cost inflicted because he's not able to do work with it. So a banker lending out money is recompensed with a natural rate of interest, given the opportunity cost that's lost by that money, and also the growth that's occurring in the economy, and therefore the inflationary problems of interest. So that's what's led the church to accept some interest rates, but not the extortionary levels. all of which is to say still often the interest that is paid out by consumer credit is much, the rates they accrue are much higher than the rates they receive at a bank account. So there is a discrepancy there that's characteristically unjust. The other thing about tithing, one of the key features of the Jubilee currency is that every transaction would be built in a 10% tithe to the local community chest. And so, and that would be voted for by the parish community to determine how those funds ought to be released. So that there'd be subsidiary control of the parishioners to determine how their own transaction tithing is going, instead of risking of the corruption where it's just the pastor's in charge or the bishop is in charge, and then the Vatican Bank has had enough scandals. We don't want to add to that. So, thank you.
Yes.
Sure. I have another question. This is really for anyone on the panel. I really appreciated hearing what everybody had to say. Though, I guess sort of my question is, maybe aside from the credit unions, which I think, as people mentioned, have sort of developed sort of more modern financial structures and institutions, a lot of these projects don't seem very scalable, and I think a big problem, and why say, obviously modern banks are a huge issue, but they exist partly because a lot of people, not just the bankers, but a lot of the public want them to be that way because it reduces risk, it allows more broad general participation, even if it ends up hurting the poor. So I guess what's kind of any of your plans for scalability, or is that just not the point? And that's just, this is an altruistic project, and that's how we should sort of focus. Thank you. I like to talk, so never give me opportunity to do it. So I think that, for example, when we're talking about Jubilee as a cryptocurrency, the other cryptocurrencies, they need to be scalable and scale really fast, right? Otherwise, they're not going to be, how are they going to make money, right? You need exchange, a lot of exchange of the currency. You need people using a lot. But the good part about Jubilee is that you don't need to start that way, right? Because the focus is not, again, it's not making money, right? It's helping the community. It's giving an alternative to other cryptocurrencies. That's why fast scaling is not important. The most important thing, for example, for Jubilee, and please, Brian and Christian, correct me if I'm wrong, is to be adopted and to be trusted, right? Like you say, we are more worried about if it's going to be used correctly, if it's safe, if it's going to protect the people using it, than to scale fast. Because since we are not looking to gain profit from it, we don't need to care if it scales fast or not. And even if it doesn't scale fast, even if there is like billions of adopters, even the small number of adopters, they can make the currency important enough. And I don't know about the others, but whenever I see that, it's something that maybe not adopted by every community, but can be impactful for the communities that are adopted, even if it's on a smaller level. And the main objective, I think, for the Jubilee team, for the cryptocurrency, is to be impactful for these communities that are in need. Because even a small amount of money, for example, if we look at the value of, again, let me give the case of Brazil. $1 is 5 reais. With $1, so if $2, you can support a whole family. So that's impactful. So even if it's small, it doesn't scale fast, it's still impactful. And that's the most important thing. I don't know if you guys want to talk.
Let me just add one thing, that as we work to develop this way of thinking, I think it's safe to say that very few people in the world think the way that we do. So part of the scalability is just to spread the idea. And because, most people, it never even occurs to them, they're not. But I've already seen it kind of bear fruit in my own professional work. we are talking to the Alliance for Catholic Education and some dioceses about a way to make a more affordable mortgage for Catholic school teachers who don't have a whole lot of money. And just sort of conceptually, we're looking at all sorts of things like an adopt a teacher program where somebody, a family who has good credit kind of guarantees a young teacher's loan, or a diocese that has the pool of the resources of their community somehow either guarantees or buys into that loan and shares in it, and then in exchange we reduce the down payment, we reduce the interest, whatever. So scalability may not just be on the project basis. It may be that we need to have this conversation, we need to try these things, and then there's sort of an intellectual scalability that can, break out into our culture and have people try creative applications in many different areas.
Go forth and make disciples of all nations. Thank you for being here.